come to the end of Dr. Martinez's presentation, there's a sadness. But we hope to have her in the fall again. So she's our wonderful returnee. The study of history, like a lot of other studies, is a way of revealing what is true to truth and what is true to fact. In my mind, reflecting upon what we've done over the last 2 weeks, we have been very much immersed in fact. I have a sense that what we're going to be immersed in today is not only fact, but truth. Dr. Martinez, glad to have you back, my dear.
Thank you. How's everyone doing today? All right, happy to be back. And I also understand, I'm looking forward to coming back in the fall. We'll have to figure out what you want to talk about next. I understand you're also hearing from my colleague Ryan Anderson soon. Next month, so you'll get more history. And I think he tends to do the 20th century or late 19th century, so slightly different stuff from him. So last week we ended with the Compromise of 1850 and the consequence of that compromise, right, being one of the consequences being the collapse of the Whig Party and the destruction of that two-party system that had kind of held things together throughout the 1840s and even 1830s. And so one of the questions, of course, will become, is there another national opposition party to the Democrats that can take their place? And if not, what will take their place? So part of the reason the Whig Party falls apart in the early 1850s is that its most prominent leader in Congress had been Henry Clay, Henry of Kentucky. Henry Clay passed away. Daniel Webster was also a prominent leader in the Senate, but he was aging as well. The two presidents elected by the Whig Party, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, both died in office. Right? So the Whig Party doesn't have a clearly established next generation of leaders. That is part of its problem. So yeah, that is, they've let the old giants of the Senate keep going and not really created the next generation to take their place, which is a problem for political parties, right? So they fall apart in part for lack of good leadership in the party, but also because they cannot hold the pro-slavery and anti-slavery wings that are emerging together after 1852. And so the question, so this leaves us with what my graduate school professor Michael Holt called in a book of this title, the political crisis of the 1850s. And with a situation that a lot of the historians of the 1950s said proves that the Civil War could have been averted if you had better political leadership. In 1840s and 50s, we have this string of presidents who would rank on a scale somewhere between unremarkable and absolutely terrible. You have a party that collapses in part because it didn't have a succession plan. Right? And fundamentally, there was no conflict. The conflict could have been avoided if we had better leadership. And again, the political crisis and the lack of solid political leadership is part of the answer to how do we get the Civil War, and how do we get the Civil War when we get the Civil War. Right? But that 1950s argument of just bad leadership ignored the fundamental conflict that was part of why the parties collapsed to begin with. Right? It's a school of thought that probably, I'm going to take a guess, you're all at least a little older than me, heavily influenced the textbooks you learned from when you were going through school, which is something we call the consensus school in American history. Right? So in the aftermath of World War II and the rise of the Cold War, you have a really strong emphasis among historians of the United States on promoting this idea that there was never any class conflict in the United States that would make it ripe for communism, and really never any conflict of any sort. The Civil War is a bit of a problem for these guys. And their solution is to say, well, again, there wasn't a fundamental conflict. There wasn't an ideological conflict. It was just bad leaders who let the country be torn apart by extremists on both sides. Right? Historians today, for the most part, do not agree with that. Right? And that ultimately, the fundamental conflict over this question of should slavery be part of the nation's future, right, underlies all of the political issues, right, underlies all of the things we're going to talk about today. So, let's jump ahead to 1854. In 1854, Stephen Douglas, who had rose to prominence because he's the one who got the Compromise of 1850 through Congress. He's a Democrat from Illinois. He's kind of the rising generation of the Democratic Party. Right? And he's taking the reins in Congress on questions of westward expansion. Right? He's very much on the popular sovereignty train, and he's very interested in building a transcontinental railroad. In 1854, everyone wants to build a transcontinental railroad. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a regional issue. What makes it a regional issue is the question of what route will said railroad take. Southerners would like it to end in New Orleans, which is a viable option. That's a major port. A lot of Northerners would like it to end in St. Louis or Chicago. Also significant ports, because through Chicago you go up the Great Lakes and down the Erie Canal and out through New York. Right? St. Louis, you just go down the Mississippi River. Right? St. Louis has a lot of kind of attractions for both sides. Both St. Louis and Chicago have a problem, which is that if the railroad is going to end there, it's going to have to go through the Kansas Territory. And if you want the railroad to go through the Kansas Territory, you have to organize and survey and start developing the Kansas Territory. And in order to do that, you have to have plans put together in Congress. And every time this comes up, the Southern members of Congress block the plan because Kansas is north of the Missouri Compromise line. Kansas will not have slavery. So Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act that said, hey, let's get rid of the old Missouri Compromise and open up the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory to popular sovereignty. Now, Douglas and most Northern Democrats come to believe that popular sovereignty will allow Midwesterners and Northerners to move to those territories and prevent them from being slaveholding territories. Right? But Southern Democrats say, hey, popular sovereignty is our way to expand slavery. Right? So both sides use the same term with very different expectations of what the result will be. This passes through Congress pretty quickly, and Stephen Douglas goes home to Illinois and realizes that his constituents are not so happy with him. In the summer of 1854, across the non-slaveholding states, there are political meetings held of people who are angry about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, who say, we had a deal, and you went back on the deal. You went back on the plan and are allowing the slaveholders too much say, even though they're in the minority. Right? And when are we going to benefit from being the majority, for crying out loud? So they start calling on people who oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act to form opposition political parties to the Democrats. And this is wildly successful. In the 1854 elections, which there's not one election day in the 1850s, right? It's all over the place. They're starting already in the summer. In the 1854 midterm elections, Democrats, for the first time in well over a decade, lose control of the House of Representatives. And it's very clear, right, that there are multiple opposition parties to the Democrats. They don't all agree on the same thing. There's one group in Wisconsin that in July 1854 held a meeting in the town of Ripon, Wisconsin, or Ripon, and started calling themselves the Republican Party. And they're calling on everyone who opposes Kansas, Nebraska to join under that banner. But they don't quite get there in time for the election. So there's just a whole bunch of opposition parties floating around, the largest of which had a bit of a head start and had nothing to do with Kansas. We also talked last week about that uptick in immigration in the 1840s, and particularly the uptick in Catholic immigration from Ireland. That Catholic immigration prompts an anti-immigrant movement. A number of anti-immigrant organizations are running around in the late 1840s, early 1850s, preventing citizenship swearing-in ceremonies, preventing recently naturalized immigrants from voting. They're big fans of doing things like setting convents and Catholic orphanages on fire. The most prominent of these groups is called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. And when people ask them about their organization, they say, they've been instructed to say, "I know nothing." So people start calling them the Know-Nothings. And in 1854, the Know-Nothing Party coalesces, right? More formally calls itself the American Party, right? And is the biggest single chunk of the opposition movement to the Democrats. Right? So they're doing very well in 1854. And this is a national party. As we said last time, that we tend to think of that immigration as primarily affecting the Northeast, but there's lots of immigrants coming to the South. In the same way, the anti-immigrant movement is everywhere. A lot of Whigs who supported the Protestant evangelical reform kind of position, and particularly were concerned about consumption of alcohol, are worried about the Irish and their whiskey and the Germans and their beer. Right? And so they join the anti-immigrant party. So it looks like in the summer of 1854 and early 1855, the Know-Nothings are going to become the new national opposition party. Right? But at the same time, this other group of anti-Kansas, Nebraska people are gathering, and once they all get to Congress, they start to meet, and eventually do start calling themselves the Republican Party. What does the Republican Party stand for? Well, the only thing they all agree on is no slavery in the territories. There's Republicans who were like longtime hardcore anti-slavery people who were focused on the moral sin of slavery. There's Republicans who really want to just go back to the Whig Party and promote railroad development. There's Republicans who are former Democrats and who are angry at the Democratic Party over Kansas-Nebraska Act. Right? There's all sorts of people who joined this new coalition. And again, the only thing they all agree on is no slavery in the territories. So that's pretty much their platform.
How do you form under the party? Is there anything formal? Is there any, you say, I'm going to...
I don't know. I don't know if they had to set a charter somewhere or form an LLC or anything like that. Now we have rules about that stuff, although it's easy to get around the rules. But I don't know what the rules were even in that point. I think they just start consistently using the same language and working together in ways that make it clear they're trying to come together in the hope of mounting an opposition in 1856 that will be more unified. Because in 1854, in the midterms, you just have a Congress that is 65% opponents to the Democrats, but not any one thing in particular. And so when that Congress elected in 1854 finally comes together, it's months. They don't come together until fall of 1855. They show up and get sworn in. It takes them over 3 months and 132 ballots to select a speaker, because they have 35% Democrats and 65% other. Right? The other all come together to some extent under a know-nothing named Nathaniel Prentice Banks, who some of you have probably heard of because he does become a general in the Union Army. But it's a challenge to get everyone on board. So, I've put this in all sorts of directions. Okay. This is different from what I have on my paper. Sorry about that. So, 1855, it's early 1856 before Congress kind of fully gets its act together. And they're about to be reelected, have another election coming up soon. They're also starting to hear reports from Kansas of what popular sovereignty looks like on the ground, where all of the groups of people decided that yes, popular sovereignty involves a vote somewhere, but in reality, day to day, on the ground in Kansas, who shows up first matters, and we're probably going to have to do some fighting in addition to voting to get what we want. So the first wave of Kansas settlers come from Missouri, which is a slaveholding state. But there's also huge waves coming out of the Midwest, upper Midwest, and New England with backing by abolitionist financiers who are sending in crates of guns. Everyone shows up to Kansas well-armed and anticipating that popular sovereignty is going to be controlled as much by guns and bullets as by ballots. We set up 2 towns. Lawrence is the Free State town. They hold an election, they gather a legislature, and they declare that Kansas is a free territory. They have a printing press, they start putting out news. Lecompton is the slave state town, and they do the same and say Kansas is a slave territory. You have 2 governments operating in the same territory. And Congress is they can't get their act together to even elect a speaker, so they're not really in control of what's going on anywhere else either, right? So, in the summer of 1856, a bunch of slaveholders attack and destroy the Free State town of Lawrence. They burn it to the ground, they throw the printing press in the river. In retaliation, John Brown, the abolitionist from New England, who has come to Kansas with his 17 children and their spouses and a bunch of broadswords, attacks a pro-slavery encampment, and they chop the men's heads off and stick them on pikes, which was a traditional response of slaveholders to slave rebellion. So they're choosing this very deliberately. This is a warning. Right? And the violence escalates from there. So Kansas basically has a 6-year head start on the Civil War. Escalates from there, yeah, because both sides constantly attacking each other back and forth. That is the Potawatomi Massacre, on the Potawatomi Creek. And so John Brown sometimes becomes known as Potawatomi Brown. Right? Yes?
In all of this, Congress in uproar, and they even pass a federal budget.
I doubt it. I don't know. The thing is, the federal budget is so much smaller back then that it may have less impact on people's lives. But they can't, until they elect a speaker, they can't do anything else. So basically, Congress did nothing for all of 1855, after having been in recess for at least half of 1854. Right? Again, does not help. It's not clear that Congress would have been able to fix it. Right? So, late in the summer, the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, rose to give a speech that lasted 2 days, which was more common then than it is now. Right? His speech was called "The Crime Against Kansas." And he called out all the people who he felt were responsible for what was going on in Kansas. Most of his criticism was leveled at the president. Millard Fillmore? Franklin Pierce? One of those two. Again, totally unimportant and unmemorable presidents, right? But he also starts calling out fellow senators, right? And one of the people he focuses on is the senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. Butler's very old. He's not in great health, but he's well liked. He has a speech impediment, and Charles Sumner mocks him for this, which today would be more of a big deal than it was then. Sumner's not not a likable person at all. Right? He's convinced he's the smartest guy in the room, and even if he is, that doesn't make him likable. He is a harsh critic of slavery, right, which is morally commendable, and yet, again, he's just not a likable guy, and he's often nasty to people. And he is nasty to Andrew Butler. But the thing that really gets the Southern members of the Senate upset is when he starts making explicit references to Andrew Butler's enslaved mistress, and how Butler will do whatever it takes to protect his personal harlot, he uses that word, in the same way that the South will do whatever it takes to protect the harlot slavery. Sumner is widely criticized for this amongst members of the Senate. Even members of his own party think he's gone too far. But the person who is most upset is Preston Brooks, Andrew Butler's distant cousin who's a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina. And Preston Brooks enters the Senate chamber, walks up to Charles Sumner, and begins beating him over the head with his cane. Right? To the point that he breaks the cane and keeps going. Sumner is sitting at his desk, and the desks in the Senate were bolted into the floor. And his big, heavy desk bolted into the floor. He's got the arms of the chair kind of pulled up, so he's trapped. Right? But he's a big man, and he eventually picks it up and wrenches the desk out of the floor and collapses, still being attacked the entire time. Eventually, people pull Preston Brooks off of him, take him for medical attention. The people of Massachusetts reelected him and left his seat empty as a testament to the brutality. It took him 3 years before he was well enough to return to the Senate. The scratches are still on the floor from where they pulled out the bolts in the old Senate chamber. Preston Brooks realized that the House, which had a significant free state majority by this point in time, was going to expel him. So he resigned, went home, was greeted as a hero, and people sent him new canes to replace the one that he had broken. Some of them were engraved with the names of other people they wanted him to beat. North Carolinians look at this and say, okay, well, we hate Charles Sumner, but Preston Brooks is a barbarian, and he's not doing our cause any good world. Preston Brooks was also triumphantly reelected in 1858 by the people of South Carolina. So we have chaos in Congress and chaos in Kansas. And so in 1856, both parties, the Republican Party, which is less than 2 years old, but is using stuff like this to good measure in its marketing, and the Democrats decide the best way forward is to pick a candidate who has no record of a political position on either the Compromise of 1850 or the Kansas-Nebraska Act. For the Democrats, that's James Buchanan, who's been ambassador to Russia for about 10 years. For the Republicans, that's John C. Fremont, who is known for being a very flamboyant and well-published explorer of the West. No political experience whatsoever. But he's like a good figurehead kind of candidate, gets people excited. His wife is the daughter, only child, of a very prominent senator. She's bringing all of the political muscle to the table. And in 1856, the Democrats won, and they retook the House of Representatives, but it was tight. And the Republicans looked at the numbers and said, hey, the population advantage of the free states has grown so significant that if we win New England, which we have, the upper Midwest, which we have, Michigan, Minnesota, not Minnesota yet, Wisconsin, later Minnesota, and we pick up 3 more states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and either Illinois or Indiana. Both would be great, but you really only need one. If we find a way to appeal to the more moderate, seen as moderate, kind of middle of the country, we can win the presidency without a single vote in the South. So that's the plan for the Republicans moving forward. And the Democrats are going to hand them a couple of things they can use. The Kansas situation continues. And at the same time, a major piece of legislation has been working its way through the courts. A major case has been working its way through the court system. And when James Buchanan was inaugurated in 1857, in March, he said, we're going to let the people of Kansas choose what they want, and we're going to let the Supreme Court issue a ruling, and we're all going to abide by both of those things, regardless of what we personally believe, which is an appropriate thing for a president to say. However, behind the scenes, James Buchanan had sat down with the Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, also a Democrat, and said, look, we need a solution here that will save the party. Right? So you need to issue a ruling that will settle this political question for us. And Taney did just that. So, what do we know about the Dred Scott case? Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived in the state of Missouri most of his life, but had been taken into the Wisconsin territory by his master, who was a military doctor, lived off base in the state of in the territory of Wisconsin, which did not allow slavery. So Dred Scott was suing the children of his former owner, who he and his wife had been willed to, on the grounds that he had been taken to a territory that did not recognize slavery and therefore should have been set free. And this has taken 10 years to get to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically came down to saying there are 2 issues here. One, does Dred Scott have legal standing to seek anything in an American court? In most states in the Union, black people could not testify in court, could not serve on juries, could not be parties to a lawsuit. So is this even a legal thing for us to be considering? Right? And then, presumably, having decided yes, what do we think about the substance of this lawsuit? Is Dred Scott free because he lived in a free territory? Taney and the Supreme Court decided no. Dred Scott does not have the right to file a lawsuit. The framers did not intend for African Americans to be citizens or have any of the rights of citizenship, and therefore Dred Scott's case never should have come to us in the first place. At which point, they should have thrown it out and not answered question number 2, right? Because they just said, we have no standing to rule on this. But we're going to do it anyway. Because we need to answer the bigger question here, which is, can you prohibit slavery in a territory? And the Supreme Court also ruled no on that one. They said, slaves are property. And just like you can take your dining room furniture anywhere, you can take your slaves anywhere. That is subject to federal control. Territories are being still officially controlled by the U.S. government. Under the Fifth Amendment, the U.S. government cannot deprive you of your property without due process of law. Therefore, you can't just draw a line and say certain types of property cannot be taken over there on that side of the line. Now, Tawney is a strict constructionist, and what's very significant in this time period is that he really truly believed that the rights protected in the Bill of Rights only apply to the federal government. Right? So, the federal government cannot prevent you from taking all of your property anywhere you want that is under federal control. State governments still have the right to decide if they will have slavery or not, at least under this ruling. So, this ruling is issued, and we have a couple of questions. What does it mean? Well, the Supreme Court has invalidated things like the Missouri Compromise, clearly. Right? But it's also, and it's very clearly made the Republican platform illegal, unconstitutional, because the Republican platform is no slavery in the territories. Right? The Republicans respond to this and say it's part of a conspiracy. The slave power wants to take over the whole nation, and they have the Supreme Court, and we therefore don't need to worry about this. Right? We're still going to keep advocating for what we're advocating for, and if need be, we'll pass a constitutional amendment that says no slavery in the territories, and then we're fine. The real question that is kind of open for some discussion here is, can you have popular sovereignty? Because the Supreme Court has said you cannot prevent slavery from expanding into territories. Well, what if the people who live in that territory don't want to have slavery? Right? The Democrats' popular sovereignty plan, not clear how that works. And if the territory has to be open to slavery until the point of statehood, is it likely you will then end up with a free state constitution? Right? So a question really remains for Northern Democrats like Stephen Douglas to try to convince everyone that popular sovereignty is still a viable option to keep slaves out of the West. Because it's very clear that Northern voters, regardless of political party, do not want to see slavery in the territories. They want that land for free white farmers who don't have to compete with the planter class. And they also very clearly, it's when they talk about it, when they write these constitutions, they don't want black people around them. So they don't want slaves in the territories, but they also don't want free people of color in the territories. And sometimes they put that in their constitutions. So the Democrats are really the ones who have to kind of prove that they still have a viable solution to Northern voters. And things in Kansas don't help them out. Kansas, by 1857-58, has enough voters, because everyone was so eager to get there and take control, that they can write and submit a constitution for full statehood. You have a couple of options on the table. There's the Lecompton Constitution that was written by the abolitionists, right, and takes more of a moral stance against slavery. There's the Wyandotte Constitution, which is more of a free state, free soil, no slaves here because it's economically the best plan, right? It's not a moral issue, right? That, as far as historians have been able to determine, is the most popular option, right? And most of the voters of Kansas would have liked to choose that one. So, we have the free state is Lawrence, sorry. Wyandotte is the more kind of economically motivated free soil. Again, probably the one that people would have chosen if given the option. And then there is the Lecompton Constitution, which is the pro-slavery one. So, when it comes to an election, voters are given two options. Vote for the Lecompton Constitution as it stands. vote for the Lecompton Constitution with a clause added that will eventually begin to outlaw slavery 50 years from now. Right? And that's it. There's not an option to say no to the Lecompton Constitution. There's not an option to vote for the Wyandotte Constitution, which is what the people living in Kansas seem to have wanted. So a lot of the voters boycott the election and hope that Congress will realize this wasn't legitimate popular sovereignty and they should try again. Instead, knowing that this is going to happen, right, slaveholders flood in and pro-slavery people flood in from Missouri and show up at multiple ballots all around the state of Kansas, multiple polling places, and vote over and over again for the most pro-slavery iteration of the Lecompton Constitution. When the results get back to Congress, more people voted in favor of the Lecompton Constitution than lived in Kansas. And it's not like this was a secret or they were confused or we just figured it out later. Everyone knew that this was a fraudulent election. And Southern Democrats said, hey, we said we'd hold an election. We held an election, we won, guess what? Kansas gets to be a slave state. And James Buchanan sided with them. And Northern Democrats said, this is not what we talked about when we said popular sovereignty. This is not what we meant. We didn't mean all the violence, and we meant legitimate elections. So, speaking of violence, there's a brawl on the House of Representatives floor, which is what was in that previous picture. On the other slide, this is representing Kansas. Right. 1858, when the Kansas vote comes to the House to decide will they accept Kansas under the terms of the Lecompton Constitution, first there's this massive fist fight, and second, Northern Democrats join forces with Republicans to shoot it down. And Kansas is not allowed to enter as a slaveholding state, because it's very clear to everyone who's looking that that's not what the people in Kansas want. This is certainly a moment where James Buchanan made things worse. He could have rejected Lecompton and said, let's have a legitimate election, and Kansas could have come in as a free state with a strong Democratic leaning and just taken all the wind out of the sails of the Republicans, because they could have said, look, popular sovereignty works. We don't need to outlaw slavery in the territories. It's fine. Instead, you have people questioning over and over again if the Democrats in the North have just lost their minds, because it doesn't seem like they are in touch with what their voters want. And they're starting to recognize that and stand up to the South more and more, because they say we cannot win elections if we constantly ignore what the Northern voters are looking for. So, it's getting harder and harder to hold the Democratic Party together. The Republicans are using all of this to feed what they call, the discussion of what they call, the slave power conspiracy. And we talk a lot about the Senate election in Illinois in 1858. The reason why, well, there's a couple reasons why. Stephen Douglas, by 1858, was widely seen as the most likely Democratic candidate for president 2 years later. So when he has to run for re-election, except not really, because people don't elect senators in 1858, the state legislature chooses the senators. So what you're actually doing, if you're Stephen Douglas campaigning for re-election, is you are going around the state campaigning on behalf of your party. And you're laying out what your party believes and trying to convince voters to support you and your party. Douglas's opponent, Abraham Lincoln, is far less important at this moment in time. But he is someone that Republican leaders have noticed and say, this guy is going to help us get Illinois and Indiana and Ohio into the Republican fold by making a clear case for this moderate anti-slavery, moderate Republican position in a way that speaks to the people of the Midwest, because he's one of them. So a lot of people are watching this, and they're watching these two men go around the state over the course of the summer and basically lay out the positions of the two political parties, the Republicans and the Northern Democrats. And what they're saying in 1858 is pretty much the same things they'll say when they go up against each other in 1860. So, what are they saying? Well, first of all, they're saying a lot. These debates last 3 hours each. Sometimes they have to run it a second time because the crowd is so big they can't all fit in the hall. They do it again. There's 7 different locations around the state. The Republican argument basically boils down to the free labor ideology. Free labor meaning the people are free to choose where they work, for what wages, under what conditions, and as Lincoln says, they eat the bread wrung from the sweat of their own brow. Right? They work for themselves and their own well-being. And if everyone has the right to do that, we will all be better off. Right? And therefore slavery is bad, because there's a whole bunch of people who can't do that, who should have that right. They shouldn't be citizens or equal or anything like that, or voters. But they should have the right to work for themselves and their families, and to be free to make that choice. But also, the presence of this different system corrupts the free labor system. It makes people lazy. It makes people not want to work hard because you have this constant example of the fact that working hard might not help you improve your situation. Right? And it makes the whole of capitalism look like maybe it's not going to work all that well. Right? So there's this economic argument. They're also hitting on this idea, right, that all of these political steps recently seem to be moving toward expanding slavery, even though the majority of voters don't seem to want that. So there is a political conspiracy. Slavery is corrupting the economy. Slavery is corrupting politics. It is bad for white people. Right? That's the main Republican argument here. Not like it's morally a sin or we care about enslaved people, right? But it's bad for you, voters of Illinois. Right? Stephen Douglas responds with, well, to be perfectly frank, a lot of racism, saying that Lincoln just wants to let black people come live in Illinois and force you to eat supper with them and let them marry your daughter. And that's why you should vote against the Republicans. But he also tries to make the case that popular sovereignty can work, even though a lot of evidence to the contrary. Right? Supreme Court has said you cannot prevent slavery in territories. And Lecompton is a mess. Kansas is a mess. The Democrats stood up, the Northern Democrats stood up to Southern Democrats over Lecompton, which helps Douglas a lot. Right? But Douglas also says, look, here's what you do. You make it uncomfortable to be a slaveholder without technically making it illegal. You could put ridiculously high taxes on slaves. Right? You can make it illegal to buy and sell slaves. Right? You can do the other things that other northern states are doing to subvert the fugitive slave law. Right? You can allow slavery in law, but make it unlikely a slaveholder would ever come to your territory through all sorts of other laws. And that's how you still have popular sovereignty. So what's the outcome here? Well, this was convincing enough to Democratic voters in Illinois that the Democrats kept their slight hold on the state. Stephen Douglas gets to keep his Senate seat. But again, the whole nation is watching this. There's telegraphs, there's an Associated Press that shares information across the country. Just 10 years earlier, you could say stuff in Illinois and nobody outside of Illinois would find out about it. That's not the case now. So, What does the rest of the nation think? Well, Northern Democrats everywhere are sort of energized. Okay, we have a plan, popular sovereignty can work, let's keep going on this. Republicans are like, yeah, that Lincoln guy, let's make him vice president, right? Let's pick a more important and prominent Republican for the top of the ticket, but Lincoln's gonna be vice president, he's gonna get the Midwest, we're good to go. Southern Democrats look at this and say, we can't vote for either of these guys. Right? We certainly can't vote for what passes as a moderate Republican who said that slavery is bad for the nation. We disagree. We've been disagreeing for 30 years. Oh, and by the way, this latest economic crisis did not harm us a bit. So whatever you say about the economy, we disagree. And we have proof. They did. They had a good argument there. But Stephen Douglas is making it way too easy to prevent slavery in the territories. So we can't vote for him either. What's happening in the aftermath of the Know Nothing Party, which fell apart in part because a lot of Whigs joined it and then had the same argument they had 3 years earlier that led to the Whig Party to collapse. But also because a lot of the people in the Know Nothing movement were angry at political parties and wanted something different because they felt like none of the parties had worked on behalf of the people. And so when the thing they created started acting like a political party, they jumped ship. That wasn't what they wanted. So the Know Nothing Party collapsed, but their success in the South really radicalized Southern Democrats and said, we got to make it clear that we are the option for Southern voters. And we are the only ones left to stand up for slavery and our way of life and our culture in the South. And so you cannot even consider supporting anyone else, especially if this is the best option we have on the other side. All right. I'm going to try to get to this. So John Brown's story maybe is well enough known that we can kind of go quickly through this, right? He's an anti-slavery activist, never been particularly successful at anything other than having lots of children. Gone on this very prominent attack on a pro-slavery community in Kansas. A lot of people think he's a little nuts, like running around with broadswords, not normal behavior. He comes up with this plan to attack the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, and use it as a base to plunge into the heart of the South, lead some slave rebellions, create some communities of runaway slaves in the Appalachians, and then become a new route for the Underground Railroad. It's not a good plan. Harper's Ferry, if you've ever been there, is surrounded by high mountains on either side, all around it. So once they take over the arsenal, they realize they have no way to do anything else. They're stuck. And there's a railroad line that they stupidly left open, so people have been notified of what they're doing, but they also have no way to get in touch with the slaves who they're hoping will rally to their cause. So they were very quickly surrounded, captured. John Brown is put in prison. And initially the response of Northerners is like, this guy's insane. This was a stupid idea. We do not support this. This is not what we had in mind. The South is terrified, as you might imagine. And Virginia rushes to put him on trial. He's still so badly wounded they have to bring him in on a stretcher from the assault that captured all of these men. They put him on trial for treason against the state of Virginia because he had attempted to incite servile insurrection. And if they had maybe waited and let the federal government try him for treason for attacking a federal arsenal, they probably wouldn't have turned him into this person who becomes a martyr in the northern states. Because John Brown gives these interviews from prison, right? And there's a lot of sense that they were too quick to execute him, and he's very stoic and spiritual and talks about how God has called him to rid the nation of its crimes. And he starts sounding less and less insane, and then they sort of lionize him and turn him into this hero at the moment of his execution, which absolutely terrifies Southerners even more. Right? How can Northerners celebrate this guy? How can we keep living in a country with people who would celebrate this, who would encourage sending our slaves to murder us in our beds? Right? And so what we see is the South really ramping up militia training and activity and preparation, and just the heightened sense that there is danger everywhere. We have to stick together on a strong pro-slavery position, because otherwise, this is what happens. So that finally brings us to the fateful presidential election of 1860, where we get 4 different conventions. The Democrats had the first scheduled convention in Charleston, which is not the place to go if you're trying to calm everyone down. But the Northerners have a clear population advantage. So, Stephen Douglas is chosen as the candidate on a popular sovereignty platform, and the Southern delegates walk out. And the Northerners say, you know what? Let's just take a break. The Republicans meet next month in Chicago. Let's see what they do. If they pick an extreme anti-slavery candidate, it's going to be a lot easier to get all the Democrats on one page. If they pick a moderate, Northern Democrats are going to have to hold their ground, or they're going to lose. So, the Republicans met. They met in Chicago. They're trying to reach out to the Midwest. And the party leadership thinks someone like William Henry Seward will be the candidate and Lincoln will be the vice presidential candidate. But Lincoln has these guys going around and convincing all of the delegates that Lincoln should be their second choice. So if their guy doesn't get win on the first ballot, would they consider changing to Lincoln? And some people say, I'll do it after the first. Other people say, I'll do it after the second. But that's what happens. There's 3 ballots, right? In the second ballot, things are already swinging to Lincoln. Third ballot, he was chosen. So now, again, the Northern Democrats are like, we cannot let the South run the party. We cannot choose a pro-slavery platform or a pro-slavery candidate, or we will lose every election in the free states. Because Lincoln is not scary to most Northern voters. The Republican platform is pretty middle of the road. Just no slavery in the territories, and let's build a transcontinental railroad. Again, everyone likes that one. So, the Democrats met again, this time in Baltimore, and Stephen Douglas and his supporters had a plan. When the convention chose Stephen Douglas and the Southern states got up and left, a whole new group of people were invited to come in and take their place. So Douglas had gone around and created and advocated for these new Southern delegates who were willing to support him. Right? So more moderate Democrats, people who had convinced it was better to have a Democrat elected than to open the door for the Republicans. And so, the official National Democratic Party chose Stephen Douglas and popular sovereignty. The people who got up and left walked across the street. They also had a plan. They held their own convention, called themselves the Southern Democracy. They chose John C. Breckinridge and a strong platform of expanding slavery into all federal territories. And the people who didn't like any of these options got together and formed something called the Constitutional Union Party. They chose John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts as their leaders. Their platform said, we support the Constitution and the Union. and that's it. Probably what they were hoping is that no one would win, and the House of Representatives would choose. Although why they thought the House of Representatives would be the voice of reason in any of this is a little confounding. If you pressed them, this party is dominated by Southerners, and they will say, the Constitution promotes slavery, right? So the Republicans are the problem here. We basically have two different elections going, right? Douglas versus Lincoln in the free states, Breckinridge versus Bell in the slave states. When it's all over, Lincoln only got about 40% of the popular vote, but he won every non-slave holding state except New Jersey, which allowed splitting. So Lincoln got 3 votes and Douglas got 4 from New Jersey. Lincoln had 180 electoral votes. He ran the table in the North and didn't need a single vote in the South to win the presidency. Again, that's how skewed the population imbalance had become. So again, if you're a Southerner, you're looking at this and saying, what choice do we have? We cannot live in a country with people who support John Brown and who say that the thing that undergirds our entire economy and social structure is corrosive to the nation. What choice do we have? So we see in particular the places with the strongest and often only sort of, where the Southern Democrats were really the only game in town politically, are also the places that were first to secede. And the Upper South, where results were more mixed, where the Constitutional Union candidate actually won the presidential election, take longer. But if we look at the positions of white Southerners in this moment, you have the fire eaters, right? The ones who'd been calling for this for years, and were like, this is our best chance to make an independent Southern nation happen. Let's go for it. You have other Southern nationalists who had said for a while, this is probably in our long-term best interest. What we need to see is evidence that it's ready to work, and evidence that the situation has gotten bad enough. Right? And some of them say Lincoln's election is that evidence. Some of them are waiting for other things, right? And there's about 10 other things that happen over the next few months that they point to. We have conditional unionists who would prefer to stay in the union, but not at all costs, right? And they also are looking for evidence that the time has come to leave. And what happens is these Upper South states are holding conventions and they're talking about it, and they're voting over and over again, and you can see the vote moving closer and closer to secession over time, and they're getting a lot of influence. There are these secession ambassadors coming from the Lower South to try to convince them of how important they are and how necessary Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee are to the hopes of this Southern nation, which gets a lot of people on board. A very small portion of the population are what we might call unconditional unionists. They're not leaving no matter what. Very small portion of the population are religious dissenters who believe they should not swear an oath to any government, but if push comes to shove, we'll take whatever side seems less likely to cause war. Northerners, meanwhile, are galvanized by this, right? They're like, we've made compromise after compromise over the years, and we're not happy with everything, but we're not leaving the country. You can't just pack up and leave because you lost, finally, after winning over and over again all these years. Right? So very quickly we see, at least in the immediate conversation, right, Democrats lining up behind the Lincoln administration. Doesn't last, as you can imagine. But we are out of time, so that's where we're going to have to stop for now. We can maybe pick things up in early 1861 in the fall, if that's what you'd like. So, any last questions? Because it's just about time. I think I have something else on my schedule next week.
Well, it's never a question of what the outcome was. But what a wonderful, wonderful lead-up. It is almost, in fact, it is overwhelming. And the question is, had we lived then, Had we lived then, what would we have done? Jaime, as always, deeply, deeply indebted. Next month, starting kind of the middle of the month, we will have Ryan Anderson with us, professor of modern American history. And he and I have talked, and what we've decided on is that we will do the 60s, the 10-year period, which I think, personally, has changed America completely. Not always to my liking, but changed it. A war we should never have been in. Civil rights, assassinations, social change, and upheaval. And we are all products of that. So, pay attention, and then when we get to June, the last of our lifelong learning for the year, we're going to have the biological expert on deer from the Division of Natural Resources. And she will come here and talk to us about Bambi and all of those folk who are nibbling the leaves in your backyard. Friends, go in peace.